你听过 China Shock 吗？一个原本属于经济学的概念，却被用来解释美国几乎所有的社会问题，从制造业流失到社会撕裂。今年这个说法又被升级成 China Shock 2.0。但这个说法真的成立吗？我和诺贝尔经济学奖得主詹姆斯·赫格曼教授展开了一场深入的对话。First, I want to start with China Shock. A lot of people are talking about China Shock 2.0. How do you view this China Shock?
The China Shock is alleged is the following. Suppose you have a company that's making a product, maybe brake linings or something that can be made more cheaply someplace in, say, Guangzhou. When that product from Guangzhou is imported under a fair tariff regime, it replaces the product that is in that industry that was there before. And so the China Shock is the consequence that those workers who were previously working in that factory lose their jobs. And there's no question about it, they do lose their jobs. But that analysis is very incomplete. So what's missed in the China Shock story is the fact that those individuals, those goods come in more cheaply, and they help all the the intermediate producers, the ones who use those inputs to build new goods in the U.S., or even to build old goods at cheaper prices. Take, for example, the importation of clothing, or the importation of furniture, or electronics from China. Now what happens is that people are able to buy a product at a much lower price, which means then that the income which they had before is greater. They can get more value. And in the U.S., it's sometimes called the Walmart effect, in the sense the Walmart was importing many high-quality goods from China, and the consumer welfare went up as a result of having cheaper consumer prices. So both firms producing in output in the economy and then firms that were buying final consumer goods were actually better off. So there's a consumer welfare gain that's not counted in the China Shock story. And there's a producer welfare gain that's not counted. There are a lot of these politicians who look only at the job loss. And because they don't count the full other range of benefits, it gets to be very difficult for them to understand. And they also forget the fact that China can actually produce these goods more cheaply means that we have an opportunity to build other goods in possibly far more effective way. So it just shifts our resources to more productive items. This is the old principle of comparative advantage, which is one of the most important and deepest principles in economics.
As you said, the China Shock actually boosts the U.S. consumption,
Yes.
economy. But why this China Shock narrative is so popular?
See, the way that American elections operate these days, and it's always been, that what you have is you have the House of Representatives, and these delegates are elected from these small regions. So if your town was been impacted negatively by a brake lining company from China, and jobs are unemployed, you have a lot of unhappy brake lining people who are living in Ohio who now suddenly are out of work. And so they are very bitter. So they will vote against China. So it's just a matter of where the benefits are targeted towards. Certain individuals are hurt. There's no question about it. But other individuals are benefited. But the benefits are too widely diffused. So there's no interest group that comes with it. The fact that I can buy an article of clothing more cheaply at a store now, thanks to Chinese productivity, it doesn't have the same ring to it. People aren't jumping around the streets and saying, oh, look, I can get cheaper shoes or better cars or better electronics from China. And therefore I will celebrate that. It's not as dramatic. Job loss is dramatic. So it's just a question of diffusion. It's the concentration of the loss and the diffusion of the gains. That really is the problem. And then Trump has just picked that up as a way to get votes in disaffected areas like coal mines in Virginia, West Virginia, plants in Ohio and Pennsylvania, and to therefore misrepresent the economic benefits of these gains. Politicians as a group have real trouble with economics.
How do you assess this Trump saying bringing manufacturing back to the U.S.? What will be the outcome?
It's stupid. I mean, honestly, it shows ignorance of economics. One of the architects of Trump's trade policy is a guy named Navarro, Peter Navarro.
Yeah, very hawkish towards China.
Yes. Musk said This guy was dumber than a ton of bricks. He has an old-fashioned mercantilist idea. He doesn't understand economics. Trump was really angry when the New York Fed showed correctly that the cost of these tariffs, 90% of the cost of tariffs is being borne by American consumers. It's a tax. They can call it a tariff. They say the argument is out there that China is cheating us or other countries are cheating. It's not just China. And so the idea is if we put retaliatory tariffs, we're going to get much better tariff treatment. And I felt like what we hear in the U.S. from this administration is something that would be better told in Spanish in 1600 by what we call mercantilist ideas. The idea that somehow we want to build in big gold bullion banks like the Spanish were doing, or some notion that we want to somehow protect ourselves from the outer world. These are ancient ideas. It's a model of like a zero-sum economy. The United States was doing this in the 1780s and 1790s. There was a tariff on British manufacturers, precisely so the U.S. could build its own manufacturing system. But in some cases, they have. They have allowed companies to build up and to get economies of scale and to get going. But it's very limited. It was not even helping the American consumers in the 1780s and 1790s. Generally speaking, the tariffs prevent gains from trade and cheaper production. You see, part of the problem, though, is political. It's not just a matter of politics, about trade, economics, because there's a growing fear of China as a world power, because China is now huge, it's growing, it's dynamic. And, there's been a whole discussion, the feeling, and Americans like the idea of being the number one power in the world. And they have had that position since the Second World War, maybe even before, but certainly after. And now it's challenged. And that challenge doesn't come lightly. And the competitor now is not Russia, it's China. And so there's a fear of China. And don't forget, historically, in the 1930s and 40s, before I was born, there was a very deep sympathy for China when it was being invaded by the Japanese, and there was this terrible war. 20 millions of Chinese were killed. There was deep sympathy, and Americans really did support China. And there were a lot of American missionaries who came here even in the 19th century. They had an idea of converting Chinese to their way of thinking. But there was a deep interest and respect for China at that time. Even during the Second World War, there were many Americans who were supporting and working here in China, trying to help the Chinese fight the Japanese.
Flying tiger.
The Flying Tigers, yeah. Believe it or not, one of my family doctor, when I was a kid, had been a flying tiger. But the point is that there's kind of deep sympathy for China was there. And then the Korean War, and when Chinese troops entered the war, there was a fear that China was an antagonist. There was another notion that came, and that was that communism was a very solid block, that all communists thought alike, all communists were alike, and that Russia and China were going to collude together, and then later with Vietnam. And so there was this notion of domino theory, which was the communists were taking over the world. And so there was this notion of domino theory. And then when it was recognized that China did not want to be a satellite of Russia and wanted to go its own way, that also was a great surprise for many Americans. When the U.S. started recognizing China and started trading, when Nixon opened the doors, there was a deep sense of relief and the fact that we could now trade with China. And so the ping pong table diplomacy, and then this growing, and then more and more Chinese students coming to the U.S. and more Americans coming to China. The whole generation grew up thinking of the Chinese as hating us and trying to destroy us. And now suddenly we could go there and we were trading. So there was this period of great excitement. And then it seemed like the Chinese market was opening up and was opening to market principles anyway. And there were benefits from trade, a WTO accession. So China became much more effectively recruited to the world economy. And so it went from being kind of an outcast state to being part of the world organization, into the UN, becoming a world partner. I think the point, though, is that so there was this whole period of fear of China. And then there was this period of great excitement with China. And then gradually what happened was the Chinese got more and more successful, and the trade engine, went adversely against certain industries. And some of these industries got impacted, and American manufacturing was overpriced. But if you look at when American manufacturing got overpriced, it wasn't because of China alone. American manufacturing started getting overpriced even during the Reagan years. What was happening then was that the dollar was overvalued, so American goods became more expensive. So a lot of the world customers shifted away from American goods. There's a book by Machiavelli, The Prince? Machiavelli, the best way that you can keep power in your own state is you have an external enemy. So if you want to be able to build cohesion in your society, you have an external enemy outside your society. And it's still a message today. If you can have an external threat, people will rally around you. In this case, it's the Chinese are the external threat. So they're threatening your jobs, they're threatening your ideas, and all these Chinese are here to steal your way. So it's good politics, but it's not particularly good economics, and doesn't really help in a lot of areas.
But why not young American people to reach out? Because the internet makes the global countries connected, and young Chinese can know American society pretty well. But why not American young people come to China and understand a little better of China by themselves?
Well, I think if you look at a lot of American young people, they're on the internet looking at wild, fabricated stories from various sources. You're giving them a rationality, which I don't think they possess. I think they're more interested in their taking selfies and Taylor Swift than they are in China. One of the biggest issues in America now is the housing price. Housing is very expensive. But you see, it's a result of a lot of political activity that's occurred, partially a result. So in the US, we have the very tight regulations for building houses, and we have all kinds of restrictions. And as a result, the housing stock actually is very limited. There are many more people who want to buy than at the current price they can't buy. They can't afford it. It's very expensive. I know that Beijing has very high property prices. It's a phenomenon around the world, housing going up. Housing going up, uncertainty going up. And the fact is that there is a sense of pessimism on the part of many Americans. And the political unity that used to characterize American society is disintegrating in part. There really is a sense of partisanship and rancor, and there's a sense of people who are actually very hostile to each other, factions that are divided. And it's not just Republicans and Democrats. And there's a feeling of the elites versus the plain regular people. Americans don't like elites. A lot of Americans don't. There's a large group of Americans who feel that they've been left behind. And they actually see China as part of the problem. They've been told that. So you go to these parts of middle America and you'll see very depressing towns, people who are very unemployed or not very well employed with low wages, bad expectations. And you add to that drugs. There's been a huge drug issue. A lot of people using not just fentanyl, but other kinds of drugs as well. Opioids.
I saw videos on TikTok in Philadelphia. People just
Yes.
sleep on the street,
Sleeping on the street. You see, in the U.S. in the past, in China, you wouldn't tolerate that. And those people are very pro-Trump. And there are big parts of America where that's happened. In Kentucky, parts of Pennsylvania. And it's easy to blame the Chinese as part of a general problem. The Chinese and the elites, Hillary Clinton.
Yeah.
In the U.S., there's something called wokeness, which has come in. People want to say, look, people should be free. If they want to declare themselves to be of a different sex, that's fine, or a different gender. I don't care. It doesn't bother me at all. But then they start saying, we want to insist that these people who declare themselves to be men or women should be able to use restrooms and gymnasiums and compete on sports teams on the self-declaration. So I could declare myself to be a woman or I could be a man on any given day. And that's insane. If a man wants to essentially biologically alter himself through operations and become female, that's his choice. I would not care. But on the other hand, to impose that on people, to force other people to accept it, and that's what's called woke in the U.S. And that wokeism creates a tremendous backlash. People hate it. And, there were these schools that were actually now, some of them anyway, in California, were essentially providing children who are like 7 and 8 and 9 years old with advice about changing their gender, taking drugs and not even telling their parents. It's a view of freedom that's so irresponsible and so out of view. It doesn't respect the larger society, the values of the larger society and the values of, I don't know, it's a kind of uninhibited freedom, kind of a narcissism. And people are imposing that. See, what I like in the Chinese politicians' rhetoric, that they talk about in a national purpose. There's a sense that you're all in it together and we're together in it. But increasingly in America, you're getting these factions that compete against each other. And they don't care about the rest of those other factions. They want to win themselves. So they see it as a zero-sum game. They really do. They don't see the idea of cooperation. And in fact, just the opposite. You have the Republicans and Democrats. And what are they doing? They're shutting down air travel, making it much harder for people to travel, just to get in check by security over some political battle. Politicians are supposed to work these things out, but they don't. And in fact, they draw lines in the sand and fight. Conflict is becoming embedded in the American political process. Now, I live in Illinois, and we just had a primary election. The state of Illinois is bankrupt. It's got a huge public debt. It's got all kinds of problems. Crime rates are very high. The roads are in bad shape. The airport's old. And there are a lot of serious questions to be discussed. What were the election topics all about? Who got money from Trump supporters? What did you like? Who could hate Trump the most? And this is how they were voting. Never an issue was discussed. I don't know if you've seen all these internet groups that create these focus groups where people live in their own bubbles. They live in their own worlds. There's no longer kind of a sense of commonality. But when I grew up, there were all these villages and towns and groups that had this sense that we're almost in this together. Everybody didn't agree. So, I remember seeing parades where even World War I veterans were marching around. They were old people then, but, there was a sense that, and the Democrats would sometimes win, the Republicans would win. I remember when Stevenson ran against Eisenhower. I was very young, but I remember it. And what were the issues? They weren't discussing MAGA politics. They were discussing things like disarmament and trying to avoid nuclear war. Serious issue. Eisenhower was campaigning on building a highway system. Mr. Stevenson was promoting the idea of disarming the world from nuclear weapons and was very worried about fallout and so forth. That's a far more serious discussion than asking whether or not we should extend benefits to one favored class or another. And that, so when Biden was president, it was no better than Trump, maybe worse. He was completely senile. And, he was just trying to buy votes. He would give money to this group and that group, forgive student loans, do this. And so you can see, think of the student loan issue. So you had a group of people, and they were not the poorest people. These are people who borrowed money to go to college. There were a number of people who didn't go to college. They couldn't afford it. And they were supposed to pay the bills of people who did go to college. And then those people weren't even supposed to pay their own tuition. And so the idea was that billions of dollars should be paid by people poorer to these people who are richer, who relatively earn more. And so that created, but Biden didn't care about that. He wanted to get these voters. So all Trump can do is attack Biden, but all the Biden people can do is attack Trump. And nobody's discussing the issue. We have huge deficits. We've got all these really deep political divisions. Nobody's discussing it. I'm going on too long, but it's a very different environment than what you're used to here.
There's a saying that the US wants to outcompete in China. They always say we want to win. And my question is, how do you define a winner in the age of AI?
Well, whoever buys it most in an open market exchange. I think there's still a notion that NVIDIA has a good chip, and it's not quite what Chinese have. I'm sure the Chinese will develop their own version, a better maybe version. So that kind of competition will keep things active. They have restrictions that are so heavy that they don't invest in the Germany's got industry that's obsolete. It's old technology. So they have regulations that are so heavy that startups can't flourish. They're just stuck. They're stuck in the mud doing old stuff. You see, that's again the mercantilist philosophy of these protectionists. And it's not just Trump. Look at Nigel Farage in Britain. Look at the people who are doing Brexit. They actually had this idea of a protectionist notion. So Britain was losing its edge because all these Poles were coming in, all these other people were competing. Britain didn't like the European Union, and they had good reason not to, because the European Union is heavily regulated and very sclerotic. It reduces competition and it over-regulates everything. They're very, very regulated.
You believe the world is becoming more protective?
Locally, for a while it is, yeah. But that's happened too in the 1930s. During the Depression, when the American economy shut down, a huge number of economies started protecting what was called import protection. And so they were forming subsidies against trying to buy American goods. So they thought they could protect themselves. So Argentina is the great example. So Perón had this notion of a greater Argentina. So he wanted Argentines to build their own planes, their own cars, their own boats. And so everything was built in Argentina. The costs were enormous, the quality was low, and they failed. Totally disastrous policy. And it didn't benefit the people in those countries. And they finally recognized it and got rid of it. Well,
Thank you very much. People are waiting, so...
And I should quit. I'm going to lose my voice.
Thank you very much.